The U.S. and China relationship is one of the most complex and consequential relationships of any that we have in the world today. The U.S. is determined to avoid conflict or a new Cold War with China, so says U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken during a major China policy speech at George Washington University. And that's what he said right after U.S. President Joe Biden wrapped up his first presidential trip to Asia. So what are the key takeaways from this speech? What does the U.S. want in Asia vis-a-vis China? And what future headwinds might the U.S. face in the region, especially when it comes to competing with China? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. I'm pleased to be joined for this special edition from Shanghai by Huang Jing, University Professor at Shanghai International Studies University, and from Basking Ridge, New Jersey, James Nolt, Adjunct Professor at New York University, joining me from the United States. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Professor Nolt, let me go straight to you because it really baffles me what he says. One thing that he said that the Secretary of State Blinken said during his speech, he said American workers are the best in the world. What does he mean by that? Who is he comparing American workers with?
Well, you've got to understand that speeches like this are mainly for public consumption. Words are cheap in politics, and I wouldn't read too much into that. I think it's designed as a political campaign slogan more than it is a statement of fact.
It's an insult to workers everywhere in the world. Doesn't he understand that people around the world, especially in China or in the Asia Pacific, will be listening to him? Who is he comparing American workers against once again? Does he not think about the consequences of his words?
No, as I say, he's addressing primarily an American audience for whom those words would come across as being very favorable and reassuring. And that's really what they're designed to reassure a domestic audience. They're not really designed, although of course they may be heard around the world, they're not really designed for a global audience. They're designed for an American audience, considering this is an election year and his political position is a little bit vulnerable anyway.
Professor Huang, what's your take, besides all of the things he says vis-a-vis how the United States is going to handle China, what he mentioned here as American workers being the best in the world? I think that's very condescending. And then he used the word genocide against what China, the measures that China takes in Xinjiang to fight against terrorism. This is, I think, unacceptable to a lot of people here in China vis-a-vis the kind of hard-won peace and stability that has been as a result of these policies that he smears.
I think genocide is a term created to demonize China, because I know myself. When I was in Beijing Language and Culture University, I have two Uyghur students. One of them, the first name is Rodman. Another one is a girl, is a Fatima. They're both from Xinjiang. Rodman actually from Hotan area, and he has 5 siblings. He's the eldest, and now he's working in Beijing. And Fatima is from Urumqi, and she also has a kind of twin sister. And the 3 facts. Number one, like my student, he was born in 1996. After that, he has 5 siblings. That means the population is growing. And when I talk about genocide, they laugh. The Uyghurs, genuine Uyghurs, I still have the pictures. We still have good relationship. And for number 2, we know that in terms of population, Uyghur people's population increases the fastest, one of the fastest among all the nationalities in China. And number 3, we know that the Xinjiang area, the GDP, the economic growth is also very fast. So it is not a fact. It cannot be scrutinized. And sooner or later, this is going to break. I think when that day comes, I think the United States government, I always caution my friends in America, you'll be a bankruptcy of your morality, because you cannot, as a number 1 power, the superpower, who's supposed to have the moral high ground, to make up such a story, a genocide, to accuse a country which actually trying to take care of their own people. And also, China actually take a much mild, much peaceful way to deal with the terrorists, extremists in the land. China never launched a war, for example, against the so-called terrorism. China never going to use weapons use bombs, use machine guns to deal with the so-called extremists. We know that extremist terrorism exists all over the world. And in that part, I think the United States also has responsibility.
All right.
Regarding the first question, the best workers,
yes.
United States workers. I can understand, because we Chinese, we also say that we Chinese workers are most, industrious, and we should be proud of ourselves. I actually tolerate on that. I think that either I agree with the previous guest said this is an election year, but on the other hand, I think as Americans, they deserve to be proud of themselves. They deserve to say that our workers are the best. I think from that point of view, I think I can stand that, because other people like Russians, Chinese, Ukrainians, all always say that their people are the best. I think,
well, the thing is,
from the point of view of the national pride or national identification, I think that's, to me, I think that's okay.
The thing is whether it is okay to base your foreign policy on such thinking, such rhetoric, such campaign rhetoric. For instance, he's talking about China posing the most serious long-term challenge, or being the most serious and long-term threat to the existing international order, and that China is the only country with both the intent and the power to reshape the international order. So, Professor Nault, what is your view of the kind of premise of Washington's China approach? Basically, they're saying, okay, we're not trying to block China, we're not going to stop China, but we're going to isolate China, because we're going to work on shaping the kind of strategic environment that China is going to find itself in. How do you see the legitimacy of the kind of premise of this kind of policy?
Well, as I said before, I think there's a big difference between words spoken in public and the actual content of policy. One of the first things I teach my students is that most of the public speeches are to be disregarded. We don't take them seriously as an actual statement of policy. Now, I know people around the world may do that, but to understand policy, you have to look at what the United States actually does, and not the words that are said. The words that are said are largely
So are you saying that we shouldn't listen? Are you saying we shouldn't pay attention to Mr. Blinken's words here?
No, I don't. Most Americans who are well versed in foreign policy don't pay much attention to speeches, because we know that they're pretty empty of content, and I think this was no exception.
But the thing is, the Biden administration is going to shape
other countries, but they don't represent actual policy.
Okay, that's your take. Professor Huang, do you think we should listen, or are we wasting our time talking about his speech here?
Yes, I think that, China already been regarded or seen, at least by Mr. Blinken and his boss, President Biden, that China is the #1 or most serious long-term challenger to challenge the international order led by the United States. And if you've been called a challenger, called your names, you got to be paying attention to it. But I also noticed a kind of slight change, some significant but subtle change in the nuance. Just a few months ago, we heard that President Biden said the United States is determined to outcompete China. In other words, U.S.-China competition has become the #1 priority in his foreign policy, and he's out there to join with all the allies and the strategic partners the United States has to outcompete China. But now, why they say that China, they don't want to confront China, they don't want a new Cold War with China, but they try to create an environment in which China, if China does not change the way of doing business, China will be isolated. I think that's reflect, in my view, a reality, because Blinken has been in Asia, and Biden just finished a trip here. They also organized a summit with ASEAN leaders in Washington, D.C. I think that President Biden and Blinken must have a earful that the Asian people do not want to take side. They do not want to confront China. They want to include China into their businesses. As the ASEAN leaders put it very clearly, #1, they don't want to take side. #2, they're not going to participate into any mechanism or any architectures that without China. In other words, if whatever you want to build in the Asian Pacific, if you want to exclude China, then a lot of people will not join you. I think this reality, has a huge impact on Blinken's speech. That's why he changed his tone. He said, we don't want to have a Cold War with China. We don't want to confront China. We just want to establish an environment in which China will be isolated I would say that Mr. Blinken has to be very careful about what he said, because if they insist on this policy vis-a-vis China to so-called outcompete China, to see China as a major rivalry in Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, I think more likely or not, it is the United States that will be isolated in that situation, because after all, the reality is that China is the center of the gravity, not only for economic activities, but also for diplomacy and political activities.
Okay, Professor Nolt, let me turn back to you, and I let you speak as much as you can. Sorry for interrupting earlier, but let's just pretend that there is something to be taken away from this speech, according to your logic. What do you think it is? Is there nothing new out of his speech? Did he say something that was not said before that you think is worthy of our attention?
I don't think it's particularly worthy of attention in the sense that there's no major change here. I think what it shows is actually the political weakness and also the limitations of the agreements that Biden was able to make in Asia. They're actually quite insignificant compared to the kinds of trade agreements and initiatives that the U.S. had done under Obama. So I think what it shows is not a politician speaking from strength, but in a certain weakness and trying to project something new that really isn't new by using bold words when actually the content's not that great. The other big point that's important to keep in mind is that the United States is a capitalist country. Foreign policy is made in Washington, but it's also made in the business capital in New York and by corporations. And if we look at American corporate behavior, what we see is that foreign direct investment to China, for example, has grown every year, including during the trade war. It reached a record level in 2021. The U.S.-China trade didn't decline either during the trade war. So even if Washington has a policy of, say, containing China, American business doesn't necessarily go along. In fact, the pattern has been to expand gradually the relationship. So that's why I say the words coming out of Washington, number one, don't necessarily represent a very significant change in policy, and second, they don't represent all of America, because America is primarily a capitalist country and most of the power to actually create a relationship with China is in the hands of private business, not in the government.
So basically you're saying there's a disconnect between the kind of vision that Mr. Blinken has in his mind for this administration and the kind of realities that they will be against while trying to implement this policy. So how futile,
yes.
how useful this kind of approach would be, because it seems they do have a big structure in mind and they are making efforts to take steps to build that kind of structure, taking into consideration the kind of moves that President Biden has been taking on his trip to Asia, taking into consideration the kind of many structures that's been put in place, for instance, AUKUS, for instance, the IFEP, the Indo-Pacific Economic Structure, and so on and so forth. So they're trying to realize that vision, isn't it, Professor Nolt? How futile is that effort going to be?
Yes, but those are relatively limited agreements compared to, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a much deeper agreement that Trump pulled out of at the beginning of his administration. Another thing to pay attention to is it's not just Blinken's statement, but also recently Treasury Secretary Yellen and the USTR, Catherine Tai, and the former Treasury Secretary Summers have all said that they believe that the Trump tariffs that were put on China in 2018 really should be removed because of their inflationary effect in the United States. So there are disagreements and discussions going on within the Biden administration. There are some who really believe that the trade war was a mistake. Biden himself campaigned against it. So I think there's a debate going on with the administration. I don't think Antony Blinken's words completely represent the variety of views within the administration, and they certainly don't represent the views of many American businesses that continue to invest and expand their commitments to Asia.
Professor Huang, what is your take? Do you think that is a kind of wishful thinking on the mind of the Secretary of State or the Biden cabinet? And do you think the Biden administration will continue to push to carry out this strategy, however, whatever support they may have?
I think that I trust the Biden administration and has really taken China as a very serious challenge. I think that is a consensus that's been reached by both Republicans and the Democrats. And unfortunately, the bilateralization, the polarization, the division, almost irreconcilable division between Republicans and Democrats and among Democrats themselves, has made it impossible for Biden to step down, to climb down on this position, and he has to, in the rest years of his administration, has to continue this position. That's reason number one. Reason number two is that the entire policy and foreign policy of Biden administration is built upon this kind of assumption or perception that China is a number one rivalry. China is a long-term, most serious challenge to the international order. And this is too late for him to make any change. So I can go on. But the challenge for Biden administration is that, number one, China has repeatedly said China does not want to get into confrontation with the United States. China wants to maintain at least a stable bilateral relationship between the two most powerful countries in the world. That's good for everyone. And second, the countries around China, except that like Japan or area called Taiwan, which is part of China, very few people in the Asian Pacific or Indo-Pacific want to go along with the United States to confront China, to compete with China. They take another route, totally different. They want to include China, embrace China into this development, which following the trend of a global economic globalization or integration. And I think the United States, if they're rational enough, they should realize that the kind of policy to confront China or to outcompete China is not feasible in this area. That's why I think Mr. Blinken changed a little bit his norms. He said, we don't want to have a Cold War with China or compete with China or confront with China. We just want to create an environment which is good for us. But even that is bad, because if we think that we all live in the same global village, an environment good for United States should and must be good for everyone. If we have an environment only good for United States of America, that's not an environment that will be welcomed by the rest of the world.
It's really interesting because now that you mentioned that, Professor Huang, if you listen to that speech or if you read the transcript of the speech, some of the things that are being said are actually quite open-minded. Let's say, for instance, he says the United States want to make it possible for all countries, including the US and China, to coexist and cooperate, that all countries should have the freedom to choose the kind of future they want to choose. And I think that should include China as well. If China wants to pursue its own future, that should be acknowledged. And Professor Nolte, how do you look at the kind of grand ideas that Mr. Blinken is alluding here? China also has this idea of harmony, of peaceful coexistence of different countries, of different political systems should have the right to chart their own future and coexist. Is there a difference between these two versions?
Yes, I think Professor Huang hit on a very good point, which is that they're sort of speaking out of both sides of their mouth, in the sense that on the one hand, he's talking about the areas of possible cooperation, and that's also alluding to the possibility of a trade deal that would result in the elimination of the Trump-era tariffs. And on the other hand, he's talking about some significant ideological differences or differences in particular areas. But frankly, from the standpoint of economic relationship, the emphasis is much more on cooperative rather than antagonistic, in my view. I do think that Biden wants a trade deal, but I think he's in a politically weak position, and he wouldn't necessarily have a majority congressional support for the kind of deal that he might prefer to have. And the second thing that's important is that he's become preoccupied with the Ukraine war and is not as focused, and his foreign policy team is not as focused on trying to forge a more cooperative relationship in Asia. I don't think they've abandoned the idea of it, but I think it's taken a back seat because of the prominence that the Ukraine war has taken in American foreign policy this year. If
you look at the 3 C's, right, compete, confront, and cooperate, that has been highlighted by the Biden administration since its early days. And now he also talked about that the United States and China should cooperate, for instance, on climate change, on fighting COVID, and on food crisis. But Professor Huang, help us understand the reaction, the feeling that China will have on its side. Is it a friendly, equal relationship when the United States says we're going to compete against you, we're going to confront you on these areas, and we're going to cooperate with you on these few areas, and you're going to do everything as I want you to? Is that going to be productive and helpful? Is it, in the end, will there be any tangible results coming out of this kind of very estranged atmosphere of cooperation?
I think the first, let me mention, you just mentioned the 3 C's, the cooperation, confrontation, and so on and so forth. I've mentioned in the early days of Biden administration. In Blinken's speech just recently, I noticed that the 1 C, that confrontation, is totally disappeared. He no longer mentioned that,
right,
which is a progress. And I think that's good. Drop the confrontation out of his entire speech. I was looking for that word, but it never appeared.
He actually said the U.S. does not want confrontation.
Yes, as 3 C, only 2 C's left: the challenges and cooperation. So challenge, okay. But when Clinton, no, I'm sorry, not Clinton. Blinken said that they want to cooperate with China. Let's keep in mind there is a condition, or even necessary condition from American point of view for the cooperation. That is, must be in American terms, because he said China is a long-term, most serious challenge to the international order established or led by the United States, which means if China wants to cooperate with the United States, China have to follow the rules made by the United States, have to cooperate with the United States in the context of the so-called international order United States defined and led. In other words, you cooperate with me, welcome, but you have to follow my rules. But must be in my terms and in my favor. That is very hard to be accepted by China's side, because cooperation means, if we really want cooperation or even competition, means 3 things must be equal. Number 1, we're in equal positions. Number 2, we follow the same set of rules agreed by both of us. Number 3, of course, we have to produce some public goods for the third parties standby. In other words, the competition is positive, have to be equal, have to follow the same set of rules accepted by everyone, and have to publish or have to produce the public goods for everyone. But now, if according to Blinken said that this competition or this cooperation is not equal because United States is in the dominant position. Number 2 is not follow the same rules that both sides accept. It's Americans' rules. If you don't want follow my rules, then you are the revisionist. You are the challenge my international order. And also, this kind of competition, I don't think will produce any public goods for the rest member of the global community.
Professor Nald, how do you look at the kind of end game or big picture that the United States has in mind when it talks about competition and manage and cooperation vis-a-vis China? And what does China have in its mind? Because China talks about a shared community of humankind for population of the globe. But China also has a vision where countries coexist. But is that the same, or is that a malign one, let's say, in the United States terms?
Well, I think what we're talking about is, in fact, a problem that's happening within American politics, because, of course, the existing world order was largely designed and implemented by the United States after World War II. Many of the institutions the United States long supported, including things like the World Trade Organization. However, the U.S. is now backing away from some of those institutions, including, let's focus on the World Trade Organization, and criticizing some of its decisions, including decisions that went against the United States. And I think what's happened, therefore, is a kind of on the one hand, the U.S. says it wants a rule-based order, but on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily want to agree to any particular set of rules, because the rules it would like to impose are not necessarily the rules that it would want to follow. And that's a real problem. It's a problem that started in the Trump administration, where Trump basically is carrying an idea of, do as I say, don't do as I do. And I think we expected that Biden would make a break from Trump and to return to a kind of multilateral rule-based international order. But so far he hasn't gone very far down the path to do that. And I think part of the indication of why not is because he's in a position of relative domestic political weakness. Okay. That is, he's got an equally divided Senate, and it's more difficult for him to get legislation to really make any significant changes.
Right, and especially looking at the kind of domestic violence and domestic polarization, the situation is definitely not very ideal for people to look at the United States as the shining city on top of the hill or the lighthouse for the world. Anyway, we are going to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Huang Jing, University Professor at Shanghai International Studies University, and from New Jersey, James Nolt, Adjunct Professor at New York University.